When Germany signed its surrender in 1918, no one imagined that from the ruins of that defeated empire would emerge one of the darkest ideologies in modern history. Humiliated, impoverished, and divided, the German nation became fertile ground for a movement that promised redemption but brought destruction. The Nazi regime did not arise from nothing. It was the result of unhealed wounds, collective fears, and a political machine that transformed despair into hatred. This is the story of how a cultured, modern, and wounded country surrendered to the totalitarian delirium that would forever change the fate of the world. The origin of the Nazi regime, the shadows of defeat. Germany's defeat in 1918 marked the beginning of one of the most turbulent and decisive periods of the 20th century. The German Empire, which had waged total war in Europe for 4 years, collapsed under the weight of hunger, exhaustion, and demoralization. At the front, soldiers returned home with a mixture of anger and confusion. In the cities, hunger and strikes had become part of the daily landscape. The old imperial order crumbled when Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated and fled to the Netherlands, giving way to a fragile republic born from chaos, the Weimar Republic. But this new democratic experiment was born tainted by defeat and resentment. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, imposed devastating conditions on Germany: the loss of territories, the reduction of its army to a mere 100,000 men, and a reparations debt that seemed impossible to repay. For many Germans, this treaty was not peace but a national humiliation. The stab-in-the-back myth, disseminated by conservative and military circles, claimed that Germany had not been defeated on the battlefield but rather betrayed by politicians, communists, and Jews within its own borders. This false yet powerful narrative fueled hatred of the fledgling democracy and laid the groundwork for the rhetoric that Adolf Hitler would later employ. Meanwhile, daily life in the post-war period was a portrait of collapse. Runaway inflation, mass unemployment, famine, and a profound loss of faith in institutions. The streets of Berlin, Munich, and Hamburg were filled with mutilated veterans, beggars, and political agitators. The 1918-19 revolution brought with it a fear of communism following the failed Spartacist uprising, and violence became commonplace. Paramilitary groups like the Freikorps, formed by former nationalist soldiers, patrolled the streets and brutally crushed workers' movements. Amid this polarization, Germany became an ideological battleground. On the left, the communists dreamed of a Soviet republic. On the right, the nationalists clamored for the return of lost order and grandeur. And in the center, Weimar democracy struggled to survive amidst irreconcilable enemies. The psychological wounds of the German people ran deep. Defeat had not only destroyed their economy, but also their identity. The generation that had grown up under the glory of the empire now found itself adrift without leaders or purpose. This sense of collective humiliation was the perfect breeding ground for the emergence of a messianic discourse, one that offered redemption, scapegoats, and a common enemy. In this landscape of frustration, fear, and rage, radical movements began to emerge, promising to rescue national pride and restore order. One of them, still small and marginal, was the German Workers' Party, which in a few years would transform into the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Behind their nationalist and anti-Semitic slogans hid a totalitarian ideology that would soon turn the shadows of defeat into the prelude to horror. Germany after hell, the legacy of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles, signed on June 28, 1919, was more than a peace agreement. It was a sentence imposed on a defeated nation that had not yet fully grasped its collapse. Germany, which had entered the First World War convinced of its military and moral superiority, emerged from it bled, humiliated, and fragmented. The conditions imposed by the victorious powers, especially France and the United Kingdom, sought to ensure that the country could never again threaten European stability. But the price of that security was the birth of a wound that, over time, would fuel resentment and a desire for revenge. The treaty forced Germany to accept full guilt for the war, a devastating clause not only politically but also psychologically. This forced confession, the infamous Article 231, served as the basis for demanding colossal economic reparations amounting to more than 132 billion gold marks, a sum that proved unpayable even for an industrial powerhouse like Germany. The territories were ruthlessly annexed. Alsace and Lorraine reverted to French control, the Saarland was placed under international administration, Poland regained its independence and gained access to the sea through the Danzig corridor, effectively dividing German territory. In the east, East Prussia was cut off from the rest of the country. Furthermore, it was prohibited from possessing military aircraft, submarines, and tanks, while its army was reduced to a minimal defensive force. In the eyes of the Germans, these measures did not represent a just peace, but a calculated humiliation. Images of German soldiers marching unarmed and of dismantled military factories were interpreted as symbols of national dishonor in the streets. Discontent mingled with hunger. Rampant inflation, fueled by reparations and the loss of productive capacity, wiped out the savings of millions. By 1923, the Deutsche Mark had become virtually worthless. Wheelbarrows full of banknotes were needed to buy a loaf of bread. The middle class, the pillar of the old empire, crumbled, and with it, faith in democracy, the Weimar Republic, born amidst the crossfire of the extreme right and the revolutionary left, was seen by many as a regime imposed by the victors, the November criminals, as the nationalists called the politicians who signed the armistice, were blamed for the nation's misfortune. Resentment became a collective phenomenon. An entire country began searching for those responsible for its downfall, and in this climate of frustration, myths became reality. The stab-in-the-back myth spread like wildfire. It was said that Germany had not lost the war on the battlefields, but had been betrayed by communists, liberals, and Jews who had stabbed the nation from within. This narrative, without historical basis, was fueled by former military leaders to whitewash their defeat and by nationalist politicians to channel popular hatred. Soon, anti-Semitism, which had lain dormant in German society for centuries, merged with wounded nationalism. The Jew became the perfect scapegoat, a symbol of liberalism, capitalism, and Bolshevism all at once. Meanwhile, the victorious powers watched German suffering with a mixture of contempt and fear. France, obsessed with preventing another invasion, occupied the Ruhr in 1923 when Germany defaulted on its reparations. Workers responded with mass strikes, and the German government printed unbacked money to pay them, triggering unprecedented inflation. The economy sank even further, and chaos reigned, yet amid the disaster, a brief glimmer of hope emerged. The Dawes Plan of 1924 and the Young Plan of 1929 restructured reparations and attracted American investment. For a few years, Germany seemed to stabilize. Cities flourished, art and culture experienced a golden age, and Berlin became a symbol of modernity and freedom. But this calm was deceptive, a fragile illusion sustained by foreign loans primarily from the United States under the Dawes Plan and later the Young Plan, which aimed to stabilize the German economy and facilitate the payment of reparations imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. During the second half of the 1920s, Germany appeared to regain a degree of normalcy. Cities filled with cafes, art, and cultural life. Berlin shone as an epicenter of modernity and the avant-garde, and industry, fueled by international loans, resumed production. However, this apparent prosperity rested on shaky foundations. The German economy was not sustained by its own strength, but by the flow of foreign capital that could disappear at any moment. And that moment arrived in October 1929, when the Wall Street crash shook markets around the world. Within months, American banks began demanding repayment of their loans, leaving Germany without liquidity. The economy collapsed like a house of cards. By 1930, unemployment had already reached 3 million. By 1932, it exceeded 6 million, almost a third of the working population. Factories closed by the thousands, small businesses went bankrupt, and farmers were unable to sell their crops. Hunger and misery spread like a shadow over the entire nation. Entire families were reduced to destitution. The workers, who had once placed their trust in the unions and the Republic, felt betrayed and abandoned. The Weimar Republic, already weak from its inception, was sinking into total crisis. Political parties were unable to offer solutions, and Parliament became an ideological battleground between communists and nationalists. The government of Heinrich Brüning, supported by President Paul von Hindenburg, attempted to implement austerity policies, wage cuts, tax increases, and reductions in public spending. But these measures only worsened the situation, multiplying poverty and resentment. Despair gripped the streets. The German people, humiliated by the defeat of 1918 and punished by economic misery, began to seek answers outside the system. In this political vacuum, a discourse emerged that promised to restore lost dignity. It was the message of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the NSDAP, a group that until then had been considered a fringe curiosity born in the beer halls of Munich in the early 1920s. But now, amidst the chaos, its message resonated with new force. The Nazis offered simple explanations for complex problems. Germany had not been defeated on the battlefield, they said, but betrayed by politicians, communists, and above all by Jews, who were made the scapegoat for all the nation's ills. Nazi propaganda transformed resentment into identity. They promised jobs, order, pride, and greatness. They promised to sweep away those responsible for the national humiliation and restore the honor of the Reich. The masses, exhausted by uncertainty and hunger, began to listen to them. The SA, the party's stormtroopers, were deployed in the streets, not only as a symbol of strength but as a promise of discipline and power. At the polls, their rise was meteoric. From obtaining barely 2.6% of the vote in 1928, they jumped to over 18% in 1930, and 2 years later, in 1932, they became the most voted party in Germany. But beyond the numbers, their true triumph was psychological. The Nazis managed to channel the anger of millions of Germans into a redemptive narrative. Germany didn't need to apologize, it needed to be reborn. Hitler, with his hypnotic oratory and his image as a savior, presented himself as the man who could fulfill that promise. In a country where the past was an open wound and the future a threat, his voice offered certainty. History repeated itself with cruel irony. The treaty meant to guarantee peace ended up sowing the seeds of the most devastating conflict in human history. The legacy of Versailles was not reconciliation, but resentment, not justice, but revenge. And upon those moral and economic ruins, upon that mixture of pain, wounded pride, and despair, the edifice of the Nazi regime began to rise, transforming the frustration of a generation into an ideology of hatred, and the humiliation of a nation into the pretext for conquering the world. The birth of the Nazi Party. In the turbulent streets of post-war Germany, amidst economic chaos, national resentment, and the search for scapegoats, one of the most destructive political movements of the 20th century began to take shape. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, known worldwide as the Nazi Party. Its birth was not the result of a secret conspiracy, but the direct consequence of a defeated, humiliated nation desperate for meaning and direction. It all began in Munich, a city that had become a haven for ex-soldiers, monarchists, nationalists, and extremists of all stripes. There, in 1919, a small group of political agitators founded the German Workers' Party, Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, 1919, DAP. Its founder, Anton Drexler, was a locksmith with anti-Semitic and anti-Marxist views, deeply convinced that Germany needed a movement that combined nationalism with social discourse to appeal to the working masses. But the DAP was insignificant, just another fringe group among the hundreds of organizations proliferating in Weimar Germany. Its fate changed in September of that same year when a jobless, aimless ex-soldier of Austrian origin attended one of its meetings, Adolf Hitler. At the time, Hitler was working as an army informant, tasked with monitoring potentially subversive groups. His mission was simple: observe, listen, and report. But what he found in the DAP was a platform for his hidden talent, oratory. During a discussion with an attendee who criticized the group's ideas, Hitler took the floor, his impromptu speech charged with fury and conviction so impressed Drexler that he immediately invited him to join the party. Thus began the transformation of a small circle of disaffected individuals into a mass political movement. In 1920, the DAP changed its name to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, National Sozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, NSDAP. The new name sought to appeal to both conservative nationalists and workers, playing on an ideological ambiguity that would be key to its success. The party's program, drafted by Drexler and Hitler, consisted of 25 points that blended nationalist, anti-Semitic, and social demands. The abolition of the Treaty of Versailles, the expulsion of Jews from public life, the nationalization of certain industries, and the ideal of a national community united under a single race and a single leader. But beyond the political content, The party's true driving force was rhetoric, and the voice that embodied it was Hitler's. His ability to connect with the frustration of the masses, to transform resentment into fervor, and to present himself as a savior of the nation quickly made him the NSDAP's leading orator. Soon, party meetings began filling entire halls. In a country where democracy was associated with humiliation and weakness, Hitler offered strength, pride, and redemption. In 1921, he ousted Drexler and assumed absolute leadership of the party, imposing an authoritarian style that already reflected the characteristics of the future regime. That same year, he created a paramilitary organization, the Sturmabteilung, or SA, known as the Brownshirts. Composed of war veterans, unemployed youth, and violent nationalists, the SA became the armed wing of the movement. Their function was twofold: to protect party rallies and to attack its enemies, especially communists and social democrats. German streets became the scene of veritable political battles, where clashes and violence reinforced the image of Nazism as a force for action against the chaos of the Republic. Between 1921 and 1923, the party grew exponentially, fueled by social discontent and the economic crisis. Hitler understood the power of symbols. The red flag with the black swastika on a white background became the emblem of the new German nationalism, uniting tradition and revolution in a single icon. The parades, marches, and torchlit speeches gave the movement an almost religious aesthetic. For many disillusioned Germans, Nazism was not just politics, it was faith. In November 1923, convinced that the German government was on the verge of collapse, Hitler decided to seize power by force. Inspired by Mussolini's March on Rome, he staged a coup in Munich, the infamous Beer Hall Putsch. Alongside figures like Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, and Erich Ludendorff, Hitler stormed into a local political assembly and proclaimed the start of a national revolution. But the coup failed. The police opened fire, killing several of his followers, and Hitler was arrested. Yet what could have been the end of his career became the starting point of his myth. During the trial, Hitler used the courtroom as a political platform. His speeches, disseminated by the press, portrayed him as a patriot who had acted out of love for Germany. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but served only 9 months in Landsberg Fortress, where he wrote his ideological manifesto, Mein Kampf, My Struggle. There he defined his worldview: anti-Semitism as a guiding principle, the need for an absolute leader, and the conquest of living space in Eastern Europe. When he was released from prison in 1924, Hitler found a seemingly more stable country, but the roots of resentment remained undiminished. He reorganized the party, temporarily abandoned armed struggle, and opted for a legal strategy to seize power through the ballot box. Nazism had survived its initial failure and, quietly, began to transform into a national movement. What had begun as a small group of agitators had become a disciplined, symbolic, and fanatical political machine. At the heart of that machine, Adolf Hitler was no longer a mere orator. He was the prophet of a new order. The birth of the Nazi Party was, in reality, the birth of a political cult, a secular faith that would transform a nation's resentment into an ideological crusade and hatred into a promise of salvation. Adolf Hitler, from soldier to political agitator. When World War I broke out in 1914, Adolf Hitler was a directionless young Austrian, a frustrated artist who had failed to gain admission to the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts and was living in poverty, nurturing his resentment of the world. His move to Munich shortly before the start of the conflict offered him a new identity, that of a soldier. He enlisted in the Bavarian army, driven by a nationalist fervor that would stay with him for the rest of his life. On the Western Front, Hitler served as a messenger, a dangerous job that kept him moving between the trenches and command posts. He was wounded twice and decorated for bravery, receiving the Iron Cross First Class, a rare distinction for a private. Yet the war gave him not only a purpose but also a vision, the belief that sacrifice and discipline could redeem Germany. But when the empire collapsed in 1918 and the armistice sealed defeat, Hitler was devastated. Like many veterans, he couldn't understand how a nation still holding out on the front lines could have been betrayed from within. This feeling of being stabbed in the back, fueled by nationalist factions, was the fertile ground where the ideas that would define his ideology germinated. In his mind, the real culprits weren't the generals or military errors, but the politicians, the communists, and above all, the Jews. As Germany descended into post-war chaos, riots, poverty, inflation, and national humiliation, Hitler remained in the army stationed in Munich. There, the Reichswehr assigned him to tasks of education and political propaganda within the troops, an effort to contain the spread of communism after the Spartacist uprising. It was in this context that he discovered his hidden talent: oratory. In assemblies and lectures, his voice rose with a force that impressed even his superiors. He didn't speak like a politician, but like a believer. Every speech was a mixture of resentment, fervor, and a sense of destiny. In 1919, he was sent as an observer to a small meeting of the German Workers' Party, DAP. What he heard there, a combination of nationalism, anti-communism, and anti-Semitism, aligned with his own ideas. But what happened next was decisive. When a participant challenged the group's positions, Hitler took the floor and delivered a passionate speech that stunned everyone. Anton Drexler, the DAP's founder, immediately invited him to join. Thus began the metamorphosis of the former soldier into a political agitator. In the following years, Hitler channeled his personal frustration into a collective cause. He learned to read the masses, to sense their anger, their fear, and their hope. In a wounded Germany, his rhetoric found an audience willing to listen to any promise of redemption. He had discovered the formula for emotional power: offer an enemy, a mission, and a savior. Over time, his oratory became his most lethal weapon. He didn't need complex ideas, just powerful imagery and a messianic tone. Defeats were betrayals, enemies were parasites, and he was the voice of the German people. The halls where he spoke filled to capacity. The applause grew louder, and his figure, once unnoticed, became the center of a movement. Hitler didn't invent hatred or nationalism, but he knew how to organize them, shape them, and give them direction. He understood that modern politics wasn't won with ideas alone, but with emotions. His military uniform, his unwavering gaze, and his absolute control of the stage projected authority in a time when authority had collapsed. The former Austrian corporal began to present himself as the soldier of destiny, the man who had refused to accept defeat and who embodied the hope of a reborn Germany. As his influence grew within the small German Workers' Party, Hitler molded his ideology. A toxic combination of extreme nationalism, racial anti-Semitism, anti-communism, and contempt for liberal democracy, he believed that society should be structured like an army, with a supreme leader at the top and an obedient mass at the base. Parliamentarianism for him was synonymous with weakness. Strength, on the other hand, was the supreme virtue. In 1920, the party changed its name to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP, and Hitler became its voice and symbol. He was no longer the war messenger running between trenches, but the prophet of a new Germany. His metamorphosis was complete. From the anonymity of the soldier to the magnetic power of the political agitator, what had begun as an outlet for personal frustration had become an ideological crusade. In Hitler's eyes, the defeat of 1918 was not the end of Germany, but its test, and he, convinced that he was the chosen one to redeem it, began the path that years later would drag the entire world into the abyss. Crisis and despair, the rise of extremism. At the beginning of the 1930s, Germany was a country on the brink of collapse. The Great Depression, which had begun in 1929 with the Wall Street crash, struck the heart of Europe with devastating force. The economic miracle of the 1920s, sustained by American loans under the Dawes Plan and the Young Plan, crumbled overnight. Factories closed, banks failed, and millions of workers were thrown into unemployment. By 1932, more than 6 million Germans were jobless, and thousands more were homeless, wandering from city to city in search of bread and hope. The Weimar Republic, already weakened by political divisions, was crumbling before the helpless eyes of its leaders. Social discontent became fertile ground for the growth of extremist movements, both right and left, in the streets of Berlin, Munich, and Hamburg. Clashes between the Nazi Party's brownshirts and the communist militants of the KPD became a bloody routine. Every demonstration, every strike, was a battle for the soul of Germany. Parliamentary democracy seemed incapable of offering answers. Governments came and went at a frenetic pace, collapsing due to the lack of stable majorities. Meanwhile, inflation, which had wiped out the savings of an entire generation in 1923, once again became a specter haunting households. The average citizen no longer trusted either politicians or the system. In this context of chaos and despair, Adolf Hitler and his National Socialist Party found their opportunity. Unlike other parties, the Nazis offered not debates or technical solutions, but emotions, pride, unity, and clear enemies to blame. They promised to rescue national honor, destroy communism, and restore Germany's lost greatness. At mass rallies, Hitler appeared as an almost messianic figure, delivering speeches that combined the rhetoric of sacrifice with that of rebirth. His message was simple and devastating. It wasn't Germany that failed, it was the traitors who stabbed her in the back. In times of uncertainty, simplicity was a powerful weapon. Nazi propaganda, directed by Joseph Goebbels, transformed politics into an emotional spectacle. Posters, films, marches, and slogans flooded the streets. Uniforms, flags, and symbols created a sense of belonging and discipline that seduced millions of Germans weary of the chaos. The party presented itself as the only one capable of restoring stability, authority, and national pride. As the crisis deepened, so did the radicalization of the masses. In the 1930 elections, the Nazis went from holding 12 seats in the Reichstag to 107. Becoming the second largest political force in the country in 1932, Germany was on the brink of collapse. The Great Depression had devastated the global economy, and in Germany, already burdened by the war reparations imposed by the Treaty of Versailles, unemployment exceeded 6 million breadlines stretched for hours in the streets, factories closed, and entire families struggled to survive amidst poverty and uncertainty. In this desperate scenario, the Weimar Republic teetered, powerless in the face of the chaos. Governments came and went rapidly, unable to form stable coalitions or offer real solutions. German politics became a minefield of self-interest, resentment, and personal ambition. In the July 1932 elections, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP, emerged as the dominant force, securing over 13 million votes and 230 seats in the Reichstag. It was a meteoric rise. In just 3 years, they had gone from being a fringe movement to dominating parliament. But this success was not only political, it was emotional, cultural, and psychological. Hitler and his followers had managed to capture the soul of a wounded nation. Not everyone who voted for him shared his extremist ideas. Many simply saw him as the only alternative to total collapse. Democracy, perceived as weak and ineffective, was bleeding out amidst inaction and internal disputes. In the streets, violence had become part of the daily landscape. The Sturmabteilungen, SA, led by Ernst Röhm, marched in brown uniforms, imposing the party's presence with fists and batons. There were more than 400,000 men trained in intimidation, ready to crush communists, social democrats, and anyone else who stood in their way. Clashes with the communist paramilitaries of the Rotfront Kämpferbund were bloody and frequent. Each demonstration ended in a pitched battle. Each neighborhood had its own war front. The paralyzed state watched helplessly. In this climate of fear and chaos, the promise of order became a lifeline. Hitler knew how to exploit popular discontent. In his speeches, broadcast on the radio and amplified by the sensationalist press, he spoke not only of politics, but of destiny. He presented himself as the chosen one to save Germany from humiliation, the man capable of uniting what the Republic had divided. He promised work, greatness, and pride. His words blended mysticism and pragmatism, appealing to both economic reason and nationalist emotion. His rhetoric transformed pain into political energy. The masses listened to him with devotion. Adrift youth, disillusioned veterans, indebted farmers, business owners fearful of communism, all found something in his message that resonated with them. Nazism did not impose itself, it seduced. And its power of seduction was its most lethal weapon. In the midst of despair, Hitler managed to construct a narrative of hope. However false, by the end of 1932, Germany was a ticking time bomb. President Paul von Hindenburg, elderly and conservative, deeply distrusted Hitler, but political pressures and the system's inability to sustain a stable government opened the door to the unthinkable. The economic elites, fearful of the communist advance, began to see Hitler as a useful instrument for restoring order. They underestimated him. They thought they could control him, that he would be a dictator of convenience, capable of containing the revolution from the right. It was a fatal error. The polarization was total. The Communist Party of Germany, KPD, was growing with Moscow's support, while the Nazis dominated the streets and public opinion. Moderation was dead. In January 1933, when Hindenburg finally appointed Hitler Chancellor, the fate of the Weimar Republic was sealed. No one could have imagined that in less than a decade, that movement born of frustration and fear would transform the world map and leave behind a wound that has yet to fully heal. The rise of Nazism was the most compelling proof of how collective suffering, when it finds no answer in justice or reason, can become a weapon in the hands of fanaticism. Germany, tired of waiting for solutions, chose to believe in a man who promised greatness. And in that blind faith, the entire country was dragged into the abyss. The power of propaganda, Goebbels, and the manipulation of the masses. At the heart of the Nazi regime, one of its most powerful weapons was not a tank or a rifle, but a voice. The voice of propaganda. Joseph Goebbels, Minister of Propaganda for the Third Reich, understood better than anyone that in the modern era, wars were fought not only on battlefields but also in people's minds. A doctor of philosophy, a brilliant orator, and a fanatic of National Socialism, Goebbels transformed communication into a tool of domination. His motto was simple yet terrifying. It is not necessary that what we say be true, only that people believe it. From the moment Hitler assumed power in 1933, Goebbels set in motion a propaganda machine unprecedented in modern history. His aim was not to inform, but to shape reality. All forms of media, press, radio, film, theatre, literature, music and art were controlled, censored or transformed into instruments of the regime. Freedom of expression was replaced by the Führer's doctrine. Through carefully crafted speeches, striking posters and an almost hypnotic visual aesthetic, Nazism constructed a national narrative that presented Germany as a nation reborn under the guidance of an infallible leader. Nazi propaganda appealed not to reason, but to the deepest emotions: fear, pride, hope, and hatred. Goebbels knew that the masses are not moved by logical arguments, but by collective feelings. Therefore, instead of convincing, he sought to stir emotions. Every message had to be repeated again and again, until it became absolute truth. A lie repeated 1,000 times becomes the truth, he shamelessly declared. Film became a key tool. Movies like Triumph of the Will, 1935, directed by Leni Riefenstahl, transformed party rallies into epic spectacles, where Hitler appeared as a demigod descending among the masses. The camera work, the music, and the choreography of thousands marching in unison created a sense of power and order that fascinated both Germans and the world. Art and culture were purged. Jewish artists, critics of the regime, and degenerate creators were expelled or persecuted, while a heroic, classical, and purely Aryan aesthetic was promoted. Radio, meanwhile, became the Führer's voice. Goebbels spearheaded the mass production of an inexpensive device, the Volksempfänger, people's receiver, so that every German household could listen to Hitler's speeches. It wasn't necessary to fully understand them. It was enough to hear his tone, his force, his conviction. Hitler didn't just speak, he bewitched. Every word was met with absolute silence, as if the entire country breathed in time with his voice. In schools, children were indoctrinated from a young age. Textbooks were rewritten to glorify the German race, demonize Judaism, and present Hitler as the nation's savior. On children's radio, traditional tales were transformed into lessons in racial purity and obedience. Nazi propaganda never rested day or night. It invaded homes, streets, workplaces, and private lives. Even sports became an instrument of national exaltation. The 1936 Berlin Olympics were a masterpiece of manipulation, a perfect showcase of the new Reich, modern, disciplined, and seemingly peaceful. While in the shadows, racial laws and systematic repression were already being developed, Goebbels understood that propaganda had to be tailored to each audience, promising peace to citizens, security to business owners, and glory to soldiers. In times of crisis, he offered hope. In times of war, he demanded sacrifice. His perverse genius lay in his ability to synchronize all the voices of the state into a single chorus, that of the Führer. No one was allowed to think independently because free thought was the root of dissent. For Goebbels, propaganda was the cement of the regime, the emotional bond between the people and the leader. While Hitler dreamed of conquering territories, Goebbels conquered minds. In just a few years, Joseph Goebbels achieved what few had imagined possible, transforming a diverse, cultured, and modern society into a collective of blind believers, devoted to the myth of the Führer and the machinery of the Third Reich. It wasn't just fear that sustained the regime, but also the seduction of its message. Goebbels understood that thought control wasn't imposed solely through censorship and repression, but also through emotion, symbols, and the manipulation of hope and fear. From the Ministry of Propaganda, officially established in March 1933, he designed a total communication system that encompassed every aspect of German life: press, radio, film, literature, art, theatre, music, and even architecture. Everything had to serve a single purpose: to glorify the Führer and National Socialism. His motto was clear: it is not enough to be right, you must convince the people that you are right. Under his direction, newspapers were subjected to rigid censorship. Journalists were required to be members of the Reichspressekammer, the Reich Press Chamber, and those who were not were excluded or persecuted. In a short time, critical voices disappeared, and the press became a unified chorus repeating the dictates of the regime. Radio, considered by Goebbels as the most modern instrument for influencing the masses, was his most powerful weapon. In 1933, he launched the Volksempfänger, the people's receiver, an inexpensive and accessible device that allowed Hitler's voice to reach every German home. Radio must be a tool of government, Goebbels declared, and so it was. The Führer's speeches, broadcast live, became national rituals where millions listened in silence, convinced they were part of something great. In film, Goebbels displayed another dimension of his sinister genius. He understood that the image had a greater emotional power than text. Under his supervision, films were produced that blended entertainment with indoctrination, from patriotic melodramas to documentaries that extolled Aryan superiority. Works like Triumph of the Will, 1935, directed by Leni Riefenstahl, transformed Nazi party rallies into almost religious mass spectacles, precisely choreographed to project unity, power, and destiny. Goebbels manipulated not only the messages but also the emotions. He knew that the most effective propaganda was not that which imposed, but that which seduced. That is why he mixed fear with hope, hatred with faith. Through images, parades, and ceremonies, the regime transformed fanaticism into a form of belonging. Every citizen was expected to feel part of a historical mission, to restore Germany's lost greatness. In schools, children learned to venerate the Führer as a messiah. In cinemas, newsreels showcased his triumphs. In factories, loudspeakers blared slogans. In homes, radios broadcast his voice. It was a total invasion of consciousness. Goebbels also understood the power of the enemy. He created a narrative in which Jews, communists, and Western powers were portrayed as conspirators against Germany. Propaganda not only constructed an ideal, but also a shared fear. In this way, the regime could justify any measure, any war, any crime. Anti-Semitism became state policy, legitimized by films like The Eternal Jew, which dehumanized an entire people. Under the spell of this narrative, millions of Germans came to believe that extermination was legitimate self-defense. In his speeches, Goebbels had turned lies into virtues. He said that a lie repeated 1,000 times becomes the truth, and he acted accordingly. In the war years, as defeats began to mount, the ministry intensified its efforts. The press and radio reported on strategic victories while cities were reduced to ashes. In 1943, after the catastrophe at Stalingrad, Goebbels delivered one of his most famous speeches at the Berlin Sports Palace, asking the crowd, "Do you want total war?" The response was a unanimous roar of approval. That moment symbolized the ultimate triumph of propaganda over reality. Even in ruin, the people believed. When Allied bombs began to destroy Berlin, Goebbels continued to manipulate the narrative. In the newsreels of the Deutsches Wochenschau, the images showed heroic resistance, not destruction. The minister insisted that the defeat was temporary, that Germany would rise from the ashes. His devotion to Hitler was absolute until the very end. When the Führer committed suicide on April 30, 1945, Goebbels remained in the bunker, convinced that a world without Hitler did not deserve to exist. The next day, he and his wife Magda murdered their 6 children and then took their own lives. Thus ended the life of the architect of the most monstrous deception of the 20th century. But his legacy, the power of manipulation and emotional control, outlived the Reich. Goebbels had demonstrated that a regime needs not only weapons to dominate, but also words. That control of the truth can be more lethal than any army. In his perverse vision, propaganda was not an instrument of power, but its very essence. And although the Third Reich fell under the bombs, the machinery he perfected left a disturbing lesson. When lies are dressed in hope, even the most lucid reason can surrender to fanaticism. The seizure of power, 1933, the decisive year. The year 1933 marked a turning point in the history of Germany and the world. It was the moment when the most democratic republic in Europe, Weimar, was transformed into a totalitarian dictatorship under the control of Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist Party. Nothing that followed, the racial laws, the war, the Holocaust, would have been possible without that decisive year. Germany, humiliated by the defeat of 1918 and ruined by the Great Depression, found itself in a state of political chaos and social despair. Governments came and went rapidly. The streets were dominated by clashes between communists and National Socialists, and unemployment exceeded 6 million people. The German people, exhausted by misery and fear, sought a strong figure, someone who would promise order, work, and national pride. Hitler knew how to exploit this need like no other. After years of political maneuvering and propaganda, on January 30th, 1933, President Paul von Hindenburg, pressured by conservative and business sectors, appointed Hitler Chancellor of Germany. Many believed he would be a weak, controllable leader, a useful instrument against communism. No one imagined that this Austrian ex-soldier, with his hypnotic voice and fanatical gaze, was about to destroy democracy from within. From day one, Hitler and his inner circle, Göring, Himmler, Goebbels, began transforming the state apparatus. Barely a month later, on February 27, 1933, the Reichstag fire, the German parliament, became the perfect excuse to begin the repression. Although the perpetrator was a young Dutch communist, Marinus van der Lubbe, the regime used the event to unleash a witch hunt against political opponents. Civil liberties were suspended, freedom of the press was abolished, and the arrest without trial of thousands of communists, social democrats, and trade unionists was authorized. The Reichstag decree, signed by Hindenburg, was the first nail in the coffin of German democracy. In March, the parliamentary elections were rigged through intimidation and violence. The SA, the Nazi Party's stormtroopers, patrolled the streets, beat opponents, and guarded the ballot boxes. Even so, the Nazis did not win an absolute majority, but Hitler had a more ambitious plan. On March 23rd, Parliament passed the Enabling Act, which granted the Chancellor extraordinary powers to govern without the Reichstag's approval. With only 4 votes against, those of the Social Democratic Party, Hitler legally became dictator. The Weimar Republic was dead, and the Third Reich was born amidst cheers and terror. Within weeks, all political parties were banned, trade unions dissolved and replaced by the Nazi organization German Labour Front. Civil servants were required to swear personal loyalty to the Führer, and Jews began to be expelled from government positions. The country was transformed into a police state. The SS and the Gestapo assumed control of internal security, while the first concentration camps, such as Dachau, opened their doors to the enemies of the Reich. Goebbels' propaganda machine intensified its efforts, becoming an omnipresent force in the daily lives of Germans. From the press to film to radio, every medium was carefully manipulated to create and reinforce the image of Adolf Hitler as an undisputed savior, a leader who had restored Germany's dignity after the humiliation of World War I and the impositions of the Treaty of Versailles. Party rallies, such as the Nuremberg rallies, were not mere political events, but mass spectacles designed to emotionally impact attendees and project the idea of a people united behind a single man. Every parade, every Nazi salute, every swastika flag that covered streets and squares served as a constant reminder of the new order. Education and culture were also absorbed by this indoctrination machine. Books were censored, school curricula were reformed to instill loyalty to the Führer, and youth were organized into the Hitler Youth, where obedience, discipline, and devotion to the regime were promoted as supreme values. In just a few months, German society underwent a profound transformation. The mixture of fear, propaganda, and the government's apparent achievements led millions to accept the party's authority without question. The reduction of unemployment through public works programs and rearmament, such as highway construction and the strengthening of the army, fueled the illusion of progress and economic revitalization, while national pride was reborn in a humiliated and defeated country. However, this apparent prosperity came at a price that few were willing to see. Racial laws began to marginalize Jews and other minorities. Boycotts and economic restrictions were a prelude to the social and political segregation that, years later, would culminate in genocide. Political violence was not limited to external enemies. The Night of the Long Knives in 1934 demonstrated that Hitler would not tolerate opposition within his own party, eliminating influential figures like Ernst Röhm and consolidating his power absolutely. The death of President Paul von Hindenburg in August of the same year allowed Hitler to merge the offices of Chancellor and President, proclaiming himself Führer of the German Reich. With that, his word became law and his will the destiny of the entire nation. Society, caught between fear and fascination, accepted a leadership that promised order and greatness, but which concealed a project of total control and systematic repression. What began as a government in crisis transformed into a regime that could manipulate millions of people through a combination of propaganda, terror, and symbolic gestures, to the point that the illusion of stability and economic recovery became a veil concealing violence, persecution, and the construction of a totalitarian apparatus designed to reshape German society according to the party's vision. 1933 was not only the year the Nazis seized power. It was the moment when millions of Germans surrendered their freedom, their doubts, and their values in exchange for the promise of an orderly, glorious, and secure future, without imagining that this illusion of redemption would lead in less than a decade to the devastation of Europe and the horror that would define the 20th century. The Night of the Long Knives, Purge, and Consolidation. Between June 30th and July 2nd, 1934, Germany experienced one of the most decisive and bloody political purges in its modern history, the Night of the Long Knives. This episode not only consolidated Adolf Hitler's absolute power within the Nazi regime, but also sealed the transformation of the National Socialist movement into a totalitarian state founded on fear, obedience, and political assassination. From the early years of Nazism, there was growing internal tension between two factions. On one side, the Sturmabteilungen, SA, the party's paramilitary militias commanded by Ernst Röhm, which had been essential to Hitler's rise to power through street violence, and on the other, the German army, Reichswehr, a traditional, conservative, and still powerful institution that viewed the masses of rank-and-file soldiers and social agitators who made up the SA with suspicion. Röhm, a World War I veteran and personal friend of Hitler, had his own ambitions. He dreamed of transforming the SA, which already numbered over 3 million men, into the core of the new German army. He wished to replace the professional discipline of the Reichswehr with a revolutionary people's army, loyal only to him and the party. This idea, however, was intolerable to the high military command, who saw Röhm as a direct threat to their authority and the SA as a danger to internal stability. The generals made it clear to Hitler that they would not tolerate a replacement of the armed forces, and that their support for the regime depended on Röhm being neutralized. At the same time, industrialists and conservative sectors, the economic and political pillars of the Third Reich, pressured Hitler to control the SA, whose violent and anarchic behavior damaged the image of order the Führer was trying to project. In the first months of 1934, the tension reached a breaking point. Röhm continued to demand radical reforms, while his troops behaved like a state within a state. Rumors of an alleged coup d'etat planned by Röhm began to circulate, fueled by figures such as Hermann Göring, Heinrich Himmler, and Joseph Goebbels, who saw the crisis as an opportunity to eliminate a rival and strengthen their own positions. Himmler, head of the SS, and his deputy Reinhard Heydrich compiled a dossier of fabricated evidence linking Röhm to a conspiracy against Hitler. The Führer, initially reluctant to act against his old comrade, eventually became convinced that he had to choose between personal loyalty and political survival. In the early hours of June 30th, 1934, Hitler personally traveled to the spa town of Bad Wiessee, where Röhm and other SA leaders were meeting. He burst into Röhm's room, accused him of treason, and ordered his arrest. In the following hours, the machinery of the purge was set in motion with terrifying precision. Under the direct orders of Himmler and Göring, SS and Gestapo commandos arrested and summarily executed hundreds of people, not only members of the SA, but also political enemies of the regime and figures considered troublesome or potentially dangerous. Röhm was imprisoned in Stadelheim prison, where he was offered the opportunity to commit suicide. When he refused, he was murdered on July 1st by 2 SS officers. The purge extended far beyond the SA circle. Among the victims were Gregor Strasser, former leader of the socialist wing of the Nazi Party, General Kurt von Schleicher, former Chancellor of Germany, and Gustav Ritter von Kahr, who had thwarted the failed Munich putsch of 1923. The regime seized the opportunity to settle scores, eliminate personal grudges, and sow terror as a warning. The streets were filled with rumors and fear. No one knew who would be next. When the killings ended, official figures reported 77 executions, but the actual number of victims exceeds 400. Hitler justified the murders before the Reichstag with a speech in which he presented the purge as an act of national defense, claiming that he had saved Germany from treason. Far from weakening him, the coup strengthened his authority. Army commanders, relieved by Röhm's elimination, swore personal allegiance to the Führer. Weeks later, the SS, under the leadership of Heinrich Himmler, quickly emerged as the most feared and powerful force within the Nazi apparatus, transcending its origins as Hitler's personal guards to become the central armed wing of political and racial repression. Its influence was not limited to protecting the Führer, but extended to the surveillance, arrest, and later, execution of enemies of the regime, both real and perceived. The purge of the Night of the Long Knives marked a radical shift in the power hierarchy within the Nazi Party and symbolized the definitive abandonment of the revolutionary element that the SA, under Ernst Röhm, had represented. The SA, which in its early years had been essential for intimidating opponents, organizing parades, and maintaining control in the streets, was relegated to a secondary and virtually inoperative role, while the SS assumed total control of internal security and the enforcement of racial ideology. The purge was a stark example of Hitler's understanding of politics. Any threat to his authority, even within his own organization, had to be eliminated without hesitation. Between June 30th and July 2nd, 1934, hundreds of SA members were arrested or murdered. Including prominent figures like Röhm, and other political and military opponents were executed on charges of treason and conspiracy, often without trial or conclusive evidence. This act of targeted violence sent an unequivocal message. The Führer's absolute power was beyond question, and terror would become an everyday instrument of governance. From that moment on, the Third Reich transformed into a totalitarian state with a hierarchical structure where all institutions, from the police to education, were subordinated to Hitler's personal will. The machinery of terror was institutionalized. The SS, along with the Gestapo, created a ruthless surveillance system capable of identifying, arresting, and eliminating anyone considered a threat, from communists and socialists to internal opponents and dissidents of any kind. The elimination of rivals within the party itself solidified the idea that blind obedience to the Führer was the only guarantee of survival, and German society began to internalize that any sign of dissent could lead to death. The assassinations were not isolated acts of violence, but rather tools of the state designed to create a permanent climate of fear and control. In this new reality, loyalty to the Führer became the supreme law, while terror became normalized, permeating daily life and social relationships. No one was truly safe, not even those who had actively participated in building the regime. Every action, every word could be interpreted as treason. The vertical power structure meant that direct communication with Hitler or his inner circle could determine an individual's fate. Obedience and submission became the currency of survival, moreover. The purge and internal reorganization served as a warning to future Nazi leaders and high-ranking military officers. Ambition or independence would not be tolerated. From Hitler's perspective, politics and murder were two sides of the same coin, a lesson that would solidify his absolute control over Germany throughout the following decade. The Night of the Long Knives was not merely an episode of internal violence, but a foundational milestone of the Nazi state, the moment when repression, military discipline, and unconditional obedience became institutionalized terror, no longer improvised or accidental, became a systematic mechanism to guarantee the Führer's hegemony, showing the world, and above all the Germans themselves, that in the Third Reich, supreme authority resided in a single man, whose will could decide the life or death of anyone without explanation or appeal. The National Socialist state, total control, and absolute obedience. Following the purges of 1934, Germany was transformed into a state without opposition, where every sphere of life was subordinated to the control of the National Socialist regime. Hitler had eliminated his internal rivals, secured the obedience of the army, and concentrated all political power in his hands. From that moment on, the Third Reich was structured as a totalitarian dictatorship whose objective was not only to govern, but to mold the minds and souls of the German people. The guiding principle of the new state was the Führerprinzip, the principle of leadership, which stipulated that all authority emanated directly from Hitler. The Führer was not accountable to laws or institutions. His word had the force of law. At every level, from ministries to local associations, power was organized in a pyramidal hierarchy of obedience. Every official had to answer to their immediate superior, and any criticism of the leader was seen as treason. With this system, the regime destroyed the foundations of parliamentary democracy and replaced the rule of law with a state of will, the Nazi Party, which became the only legal political party, merged with the state apparatus. Its mission was not only to administer but also to indoctrinate organizations such as the Hitler Youth, the League of German Girls, and the German Labour Front were created to control every aspect of society: education, culture, work, and leisure. From childhood, Germans were trained to see Hitler as the savior of the nation. Obedience as a virtue and dissent as a threat to the fatherland. Propaganda played a fundamental role in this process. Under the direction of Joseph Goebbels, the Ministry of Propaganda controlled the media, the press, radio, film, and the arts. Information was carefully manipulated to build a cult of personality around Hitler and promote an idealized vision of the people's community, Volksgemeinschaft. News reports extolled the regime's achievements, films glorified racial unity, and mass marches reinforced the sense of collective belonging. In this new order, truth ceased to have intrinsic value. Only what served the state's purpose mattered. Control also extended to the labor and economic spheres. Trade unions were dissolved and replaced by the German Labour Front, which abolished the right to strike and subordinated workers to the national interest. The economy was reorganized according to an autarkic and militaristic logic geared toward rearmament. Large public works projects, such as the construction of highways and the expansion of the arms industry, served both to reduce unemployment and to prepare the country for war. Behind the rhetoric of prosperity, however, lay a system based on repression, espionage, and fear. The Gestapo, the state's secret police, became the symbol of everyday terror. He had absolute power to arrest anyone suspected of subversive activities without a warrant. Millions of Germans were watched, denounced, or interrogated by their own neighbors in an atmosphere of widespread distrust. Meanwhile, the SS under Heinrich Himmler evolved from the Führer's personal guard into an autonomous power organization tasked with ensuring racial purity and the security of the regime. Repression was not limited to political enemies. The Nazi state also waged an internal war against those considered biologically inferior or socially undesirable. Jews, Roma, the disabled, homosexuals, and ideological opponents were marginalized, sterilized, or interned in concentration camps. The Nuremberg race laws, enacted in 1935, institutionalized discrimination and stripped German Jews of their citizenship. Nazi ideology infiltrated even science and education, where racial biology, eugenics, and anti-Semitism were presented as unquestionable truths. Schools ceased to be spaces for critical thinking and became centers of political indoctrination. Children learned to measure skulls, identify Aryan traits, and venerate the Führer as an almost divine figure. Every book, every film, and every public act aimed to reaffirm the superiority of the German people and justify absolute obedience to the state religion, while not abolished, was neutralized. The regime attempted to subordinate churches to its control through the Reich Church movement, while repressing clergy who resisted the politicization of faith. In this context, National Socialism became a kind of secular religion, with its own rituals, symbols, and dogmas. The swastika replaced the crucifix in many places, and salutes to the Führer replaced prayers in schools. Loyalty to the state was conflated with loyalty to God. By 1938, the regime's control over society was almost total. There was no room for neutrality or silent dissent. Every German was expected to participate, obey, or remain silent. Terror was not accidental, but a deliberate tool to ensure conformity. The combination of fear, Propaganda and reward built a social machine that seemed invulnerable, but beneath this facade of unity and order, Germany was preparing for its darkest destiny, the use of this absolute power not only to dominate its own people, but to subjugate the entire world. The National Socialist state had achieved its goal, a disciplined, fanatical nation ready to follow its leader without question, even to the abyss. When reason surrenders to fanaticism. The rise and consolidation of the Nazi regime was not an isolated accident of history, but the result of a complex process in which reason, ethics, and truth were slowly replaced by fanaticism, obedience, and emotional manipulation. Germany, a nation with one of the richest cultural and scientific traditions in Europe, fell into a spiral of collective irrationality that demonstrated the depths to which humanity can sink when desperation mixes with ideology and fear becomes a tool of control. The Third Reich not only built a political system, but a secular religion, a faith based on the cult of the leader, racial purity, and the promise of national redemption. Hitler and his movement understood that the masses are not won over with arguments, but with emotions, that resentment can be molded into power, and that a lie repeated 1,000 times can replace the truth. Joseph Goebbels understood this with surgical precision. It is not necessary to convince intellectually, but to conquer spiritually. And so they did, transforming politics into spectacle, propaganda into dogma, and obedience into virtue. Under the influence of National Socialism, morality was rewritten. What was once considered a crime became a duty. What was once compassion was transformed into weakness. Reason, subjected to the power of myth, ceased to be a guide and became a mere instrument. Intellectuals, scientists, artists, and ordinary citizens participated, whether by conviction or silence, in the construction of a machine that would ultimately devour them all. In Hitler's speeches, hatred was disguised as patriotism. In classrooms, racial biology replaced science. In churches, nationalism replaced faith. Every sphere of German life was absorbed by the regime until no room remained for dissent or individual thought. National Socialist fanaticism not only destroyed its victims but also those who embraced it, because it nullified their capacity to discern between good and evil. Blind obedience, justified as patriotic duty, became the moral alibi for millions. The history of Nazism is ultimately a warning about the corrosive power of ideology when it takes hold of the collective mind. It reminds us that barbarity does not arise from nothing, but rather germinates slowly in societies that abandon critical thinking, seek simplistic solutions to complex problems, and place their fate in the hands of a single man. The applause, marches, and speeches that once seemed symbols of national pride transformed over time into echoes of an irreparable tragedy. What is most disturbing is that evil, in its purest form, did not appear with the face of a monster, but rather with that of the obedient neighbor, the efficient civil servant, the committed teacher, the soldier who was just following orders. The Third Reich did not emerge from nothing. It was the result of a confluence of social, political, and economic factors that found fertile ground in the despair and resentment of the German population after the First World War, and the imposition of the Treaty of Versailles. Millions of citizens, trapped between poverty, mass unemployment, and national humiliation, chose not to question the solutions offered by the Nazi Party, did not inquire about the legitimacy of its methods, nor did they reflect on the moral consequences of its actions. This combination of fear, opportunism, and a thirst for order allowed propaganda, the manipulation of information, and systematic violence to become everyday tools of power. From education to culture, from the press to public spaces, society was molded to accept without question the Führer's absolute authority, racial supremacy, and the elimination of those considered enemies of the Reich. Blind obedience became the norm, while violence was normalized. Pogroms, internal purges, and the persecution of Jews, communists, the disabled, and political opponents became part of daily life. Stories like those of Dachau and Sachsenhausen, the first concentration camps where political repression was intertwined with terror, show how fear was used to suppress any trace of dissent. The racial laws of 1935, known as the Nuremberg Laws, legalized segregation and laid the groundwork for systematic exclusion and later for genocide. But the danger of the Third Reich lay not only in its laws or its weapons. It lay in the passivity of those who could have questioned, resisted, or denounced it. When reason surrenders to fanaticism, Humanity becomes its own victim. Individuals accept murder, persecution, and injustice as inevitable, even necessary. Remembering this history is not an act of guilt, but a vital exercise in critical memory and ethical resistance. Every lesson from the past warns us that fear, propaganda, and disinformation can erode the firmest convictions, transform obedience into apparent virtue, and cause entire societies to forget empathy and moral judgment. Germany in the 1930s and 40s demonstrates that no civilization is automatically safe from falling into darkness. Even a cultured and advanced people can succumb if they prioritize order over justice, authority over freedom, and obedience over conscience. The history of the Nazi regime reveals with chilling clarity that humanity's fragility lies not only in the evil of a few, but in the silent complicity of many, in the capacity to let fear and fanaticism override reflection and judgment when reason is abandoned, hatred is normalized, and blind obedience is glorified. The price is always the same: the loss of humanity, the destruction of collective morality, and the opening of the door to horrors that defy all comprehension. Therefore, studying and remembering the origins of the Nazi regime is not just a look at the past, but a timeless reminder that ethical vigilance and critical awareness are the most essential guardians of freedom and human dignity. The Nazi regime did not emerge overnight, but was the result of a process in which crisis, resentment, and manipulation intertwined to shape one of humanity's darkest chapters. Germany, devastated by war and humiliated by defeat, became fertile ground where extreme ideas germinated, promising order, greatness, and redemption. But behind those promises lay a project of unprecedented moral and human destruction. The Third Reich was not merely a political experiment, it was proof of how far a society can sink when fear, propaganda, and blind faith replace critical thinking and compassion. The story of its origins should not be seen merely as a warning about the past, but as a mirror for the present. Because the same forces that gave rise to National Socialism, hopelessness, hatred disguised as patriotism, the search for an enemy to blame, continue to exist in new forms in different parts of the world. Remembering the rise of the Nazi regime is not looking back in horror, but forward with responsibility. Each generation must decide whether to learn from history or repeat it, and perhaps that is the most painful and most urgent lesson. The monsters of the past do not disappear, they merely wait for oblivion to open the door for them once again.